The Spithead Mutiny of 1797, a moment of defiance and change in the Royal Navy. The Spithead Mutiny of April 1797 is a pivotal moment in British naval history, often overshadowed by the more dramatic Nore Mutiny that followed later that year. Nevertheless, the Spithead Mutiny marked the beginning of a significant protest by sailors who had endured dire conditions and felt betrayed by their officers and the British government. Though it did not result in violence or bloodshed, it demonstrated the discontent and unrest simmering beneath the surface of the Royal Navy. Background. In the late 18th century, Britain was embroiled in the French Revolutionary Wars, which placed immense pressure on the Royal Navy. The fleet was constantly on alert, battling both the French and other enemies, leading to prolonged periods at sea. Sailors often spent months or even years away from their families and homes, with inadequate provisions, overcrowded ships, and minimal rest. The British Navy, essential to Britain's global power, was largely composed of press-ganged men, sailors forced into service, as well as volunteers who had no choice but to accept the harsh conditions. The daily life aboard these ships was grueling. Sailors were poorly fed, often suffering from scurvy, and had to endure brutal punishments for minor infractions. Pay was irregular and insufficient, and officers were frequently seen as tyrannical, adding to the tension between the men and their superiors. Many sailors felt that their sacrifices were not being honored by the government, which was focused more on winning battles and defending the empire than on improving their living conditions. The outbreak of the mutiny. The Spithead Mutiny began at Spithead, an anchorage off the coast of Portsmouth. The sailors aboard the ships stationed there were angry about a range of issues, including the low wages, poor food rations, and mistreatment by officers. But it was the combination of these grievances, and the sailors' frustration with the lack of reforms, that led them to act. On April 16, 1797, the sailors aboard the ships of the fleet, which were anchored at Spithead, decided to collectively protest. They lowered their flags, signifying a refusal to continue working until their demands were met. Crucially, however, this mutiny was peaceful. Unlike the violent uprisings seen in later naval mutinies, the men at Spithead did not engage in any direct confrontation. Instead, they called for negotiations with the government. The sailors had several demands. 1. Better pay. They wanted an increase in wages, as their compensation was insufficient given the dangers and hardships of life at sea. 2. Improved conditions. They demanded better rations, including improved food, which was often stale or inadequate. 3. Removal of officers. There were specific complaints about the behavior of certain officers, including accusations of cruelty or poor leadership. The sailors requested that some of these officers be removed. The mutineers also wished for the restoration of the full pay they had once been promised but never received, and they wanted to ensure that those who had served the longest were not treated as expendable. Personal reminiscences of the sailors. In the midst of the unrest, many sailors likely felt a sense of unity and purpose, as their actions were not driven by individual grievances but by the shared experience of suffering at the hands of their officers and the Navy's indifferent bureaucracy. For many, the decision to mutiny was not taken lightly. Some sailors had likely been at sea for years, separated from their families and homes, with little hope of respite. Imagine the thoughts of a young sailor, a man in his early 20s, who had spent more time aboard a ship than he had on land, enduring the harsh discipline of officers who treated him like little more than a cog in a vast, uncaring machine. One can imagine a sailor, feeling the oppressive weight of his years of service, suddenly realizing that he had the power to act. Perhaps, like many others, he could no longer stomach the low pay or the tasteless, moldy bread that was his daily sustenance. His spirit, beaten by the daily grind of naval life, found new strength in the solidarity of his comrades. Together, they refused to continue serving until their grievances were addressed. The sailors must have felt a sense of triumph when they lowered their flags and found that they were not alone. Dozens, if not hundreds, of ships joined the protest, signaling that their demands could no longer be ignored. For the first time, the men saw their power, not as individuals, but as a collective force. The Navy, the very instrument of British naval supremacy, had been halted. The resolution. The Spithead Mutiny could have escalated into violence, but it did not. The officers, aware of the possibility of further unrest, chose to negotiate with the mutineers. The government, led by Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger, sent representatives to discuss the sailors' demands. In the end, the sailors received many of their demands. 1. Pay increase. The government agreed to an increase in pay. 2. Better conditions. Rations were improved, and the conditions aboard ships were addressed, though not fully to the satisfaction of all sailors. 3. Officers removed. Some officers were removed or reassigned, though the full reform of the naval officer class did not come to pass. The mutiny was a victory for the sailors, and the government did not resort to violent repression, understanding that it would be more damaging to the fleet in the long term. The leaders of the mutiny were not punished, and in the aftermath, many sailors felt a sense of pride in what they had accomplished. Legacy and impact. While the Spithead Mutiny was a peaceful one, its impact was lasting. The successful negotiation with the government gave the sailors a sense of agency and set a precedent for further naval protests, most notably the Nore Mutiny a month later. However, the events of Spithead showed that when the sailors were united, they could exert significant pressure on the government, which would have far-reaching consequences for the treatment of sailors in the years to come. It also revealed a fundamental truth about the Royal Navy, that it was not invulnerable, and the men who served in it, though often seen as expendable, were capable of changing the system. The mutiny, though largely forgotten in popular culture, was an early glimpse of the power of collective action, something that would resonate with future labor movements in the 19th and 20th centuries. In personal recollections, the men who took part in the Spithead Mutiny likely remembered it as a turning point, a moment when they, as individuals, had been powerless, but as a group, they had fought for and won better conditions. For many, it was a moment of empowerment in a career that had previously seemed like a one-way journey into hardship. They had become not just sailors, but agents of change. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons to stay updated with more content. This content has been adapted from the powerful features of Polyspeaks for You, South Africa's leading accessibility software. Learn more at www.polyspeaksforyou.co.za. We invite you to support this meaningful dyslexic initiative, crafted and developed by an individual who personally understands the challenges of dyslexia.